Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to begin. The program is about to begin. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vice President of Technology and Innovation at Stand Together and the Charles Koch Institute, Jesse Blumenthal.
Thank you so much, Anonymous Voice, and thank you all so much for sticking around through lunch. I am absolutely thrilled to be able to introduce our afternoon keynote and our next speaker, Jason Feifer. Jason Feifer does a lot of things. He's the editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine. He's the host of numerous podcasts, including Pessimist's Archive. Gene this morning started talking about the sort of lessons from history and looking to the past as we consider the future of speech online. And I think what Jason's podcast and talk really focuses on is exactly picking up on that theme. That what we're going through right now, grappling with new technology, how does it change society? What does it mean for my ability to speak, for our ability to communicate with one another, are not new. And that there are lessons from things that we take for granted. Comic books, chain stores, the telegraph, the Waltz, the umbrella, coffee, right? Like stuff that I'm sure many of us enjoy in our day-to-day lives. At their time, were revolutionary. And what I love about Pessimist's Archive is it's that history, the history of why we resist new things and how they come to be commonplace. And I think that's just a perfect fit and a natural complement to so many of the discussions we're having today. So while I am at the microphone, I will encourage all of you to go on Twitter and follow @Pessimist'sArc and go onto your podcast app of choice and subscribe to the podcast. And welcome to the stage, Jason Feifer.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jesse, for that lovely and wonderfully promotional introduction. I really appreciate it. Right, of course, today is a day talking about speech and about technology, which really means that it's talking about change, because change is, of course, at the very heart of this, and change is very scary and very difficult. And so what I'd love to do today is talk you through some of the lessons that I have learned in studying change, in studying how people have resisted and then eventually come to embrace new technologies. And to start, I'd like to take you to the bicycle. So when the bicycle was introduced, it, like just about everything else, when it is new, freaked people out. And people were very concerned for all sorts of reasons. For example, people were concerned that the wheel spinning constantly was something that we were not physically able to manage in our brains, and thus it would make us homicidal. We were also concerned, is anybody a sufferer of, don't be afraid, of bicycle face? Any suffer? So this was an actual medical condition believed at the time in which wind would be blowing in our faces while we were riding the bicycle so much that it would permanently stretch out our faces and we would have bicycle face. But the thing that I love most in the research that I had done about the bicycle was this one article from 1896 talking to business owners about their concerns about the bicycle, because there were many of them. So, for example, the bar owners were concerned that people weren't coming into the bars in the middle of the day anymore to drink beer because now they were drinking water because they were riding the bicycle. They were also concerned, the cobblers were concerned because the people weren't buying as many heavy shoes because they were buying lighter shoes because they were riding the bicycle. And my favorite is the fancy felt hat guy. The fancy felt hat guy who was very, very concerned that people weren't buying as many fancy felt hats because they were buying these lighter caps because they were riding the bicycle. And so he told a reporter at the time that he believed, and here it is, let's look at it. One irate member of the trade proposes that Congress be asked to pass a law compelling each bicycle rider to purchase at least 2 felt hats a year to compensate him for the loss of sales. Now, we laugh at this, as we should, and yet I propose to you all that we have done some version of this ourselves, right? Where we were good at something, we knew something, we were comfortable with something, and then change came along and we said, no! No, I'm saying right here, you change. I'm not changing. I already know this thing. I'm very comfortable with this thing. And that is natural, but it is also wrong. Because, for example, with this fancy felt hat guy, had this guy said, you know what? I don't make fancy felt hats. I make hats. I make hats, and I will make hats for anybody who wants a hat. I don't care if you're riding a bicycle. If you do, then I will make a hat for you. Whatever it is, I want hats. That guy would have made a killing because, as it turns out, the hat and cap industry is twice the size of the bicycle industry. There was a killing to be made. But this is what we do. This is so natural. When we're talking about people embracing change, we are going up literally against the thing that we are born with, which is a resistance to change. For example, this is my child. He is Fen. He's 4 years old, and this is the day that we got him new shoes. He was very upset about it. He kept saying that he wanted his old shoes. I want my old shoes. I want my old shoes. And we were trying to say, Fen, when your old shoes were new shoes, you hated them too. But he can't understand that. But we force him to wear the new shoes, and a couple days later, look, he's thrilled. He likes the new shoes. So what I want to do now is break down 3 ways that I have seen, 3 patterns that I have seen in resistance to change. And then 3 ways in which I think that we can get people closer to embracing that change. So here's number 1. We are losing something fundamental. This is a great fear. You see it throughout history. We're losing something fundamental. Here's an example. So this is an illustration that ran with an essay written by John Philip Sousa at the dawn of recorded music. Now, John Philip Sousa, perhaps you know his name. He's written every march you know. Da, 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 da. That's John Philip Sousa. John Philip Sousa was very, very opposed to recorded music. Well, he was a live music guy. And so he argued he had many arguments, but this is my favorite. This representation is my favorite. Here it is. He's arguing that, follow me here, recorded music will replace all forms of live music. And live music, by the way, in case you don't know, is a phrase that actually came out of the musicians' unions when they were trying to campaign against recorded music technology. They were trying to contrast dead or canned music with live music. That's where we get that phrase from. So he's saying that recorded music will replace all forms of live music, which means that if you bring recorded music technology into the home, well then, it will stop mothers from singing to their children. Why would they do that? They would instead just put the recorded music technology in front of the children. And because children grow up imitating their mothers, that means naturally that we will raise a generation of machine babies. And, you know, that's not correct. But you can see how people are afraid. That they're afraid that when you introduce something new, that it replaces everything, every form of it. But that's, of course, not what happens. I mean, what John Philip Sousa is saying is really no different from the movie theater industry being afraid that VCRs were going to shut them down. The thing is that we don't replace everything; we integrate. New things don't replace all the time; they integrate, and we don't naturally understand that. Here's number 2. We're creating an imbalance from which we cannot recover. I'm going to break this into 2. The first one is protectionism. We've all seen that. Here's one of my favorite examples. So these are some women who are campaigning against laws that have made margarine far too expensive because of taxes, but also 30 states enjoy margarine but don't enjoy paying taxes. Do you know what some of the other states enjoyed? Pink and black margarine, because the butter industry had done such a good job of passing laws to make margarine seem unappealing. And well, what's happening here? I mean, I go back to this thing that I said, we're creating an imbalance from which we cannot recover, because I think that these incumbents are feeling like they've earned this, they've owned this, and now something has come along, and they don't believe that they can compete in an open marketplace. So we've created an imbalance from which we cannot recover. There's also, of course, the cultural version of this. So here's novel reading, A Cause of Female Depravity, in which, in this case, somebody is describing parents being driven to a premature grave because their daughters are reading novels. Again, what is really happening here? I'll tell you, the way that I see it is that people are seeing a change, and they're not understanding that we can adapt to that change. They're not seeing that we aren't as simple as the thing that we're looking at. I have this theory. It's called that people confuse the shape with the thing. The thing is something fundamental about us. Maybe it's intellectual exercise. Maybe it's conversation or community. And then the shape is just the way in which it is expressed in any one generation. So it's WhatsApp groups or it's bowling leagues. And one generation comes up and sees a community is bowling leagues, and then the bowling league goes away and it's replaced by something else, and they say, oh no, we've lost community. You haven't lost community. You just lost the shape that you were familiar with of community. It's an important distinction, but we confuse the two, and we think that we're losing something fundamental when something changes, even though we're not. Number 3, this change is unnatural. Kind of very similar, in a way, to what I was talking about, but I want to draw a distinction here. So I love this. This is just a nice collection, right in one article, of all the diseases following in the train of progressing civilization. So we've got all sorts of things: railroad kidney, telephone tinnitus. These are real things that people were very concerned about at the time. There was neurasthenia was a turn-of-the-century condition, people believed. It basically meant that life was so busy that you had a disease, that your brain was breaking down. This should sound familiar. This is basically what we talk about now when we talk about addictive technology. The technology is too addictive. Our brains are not built to handle it. We've created something unnatural. Now, those are 3 patterns that I've seen, and before I move on to solutions, I want to pose a kind of philosophical question, which is, why does this matter? Why does it matter? Why does it matter that people are upset, afraid? Also, possibly, maybe they were right. They saw some change. They didn't not see change. So what is important here? Why are we talking about this? Why should we care about this? Let me answer that by first introducing you to the automobile brain! The automobile brain! So in the dawn of the automobile, scientists were very concerned that the car was literally changing the shape of people's brains. Literally changing. Look at that. That is an actual illustration that ran in the New York Times in, I think, 1902. And of course, you see, the brain specialist predicted that motor maniacs will be represented in the insane asylum in the near future, changing our brains. And here's the thing. That guy was right, in a way. He was right about something. What he was right about was that the car does change our brains. I mean, I called a neuroscientist recently, and I asked him, if you scanned the brain of somebody before they learned how to drive the car today, and then scanned them after they learned how to drive the car, would the brain change? Would you see a change? The answer is yes. I mean, you know what? You could see a change before all of your brains, before you walked in today, and afterwards. Because the thing is that the brain is supposed to change. It's literally supposed, it is built to change. That is what we are supposed to do. But what happens is that we see change, and we don't recognize it as part of a pattern. We don't see that change is the constant. We think that change is a singular incident, and then that thus must mean that we have done something terrible to ourselves. But change is the constant. So if we only recognize change as being something that is disruptive and not something that is part of a natural progression, well, what do? Well, we do 2 things, as I see it. One, we miss opportunities, important opportunities. And then number 2, we propose the wrong solutions. So here's what I mean. For example, here's the classic Atlantic cover: is Google stupid? Is Google making us stupid? So right, what the net seems to be doing is chipping away at my capacity for concentration and contemplation. That's what the writer in the Atlantic. And then just just for contrast, because that was not a new observation, 1922. It is the day of the fleeting vision. Concentration, thoroughness, the quieter reflection that ripens the judgment are more difficult than ever. What has happened? I think that people, you see how we're responding to having something like Google in our lives, and we say, oh, well, you know what? People aren't maybe memorizing information as much. They're not thinking the way that they used to. They're not approaching information in the same way as before. Because for a long time, retention of information was a very valuable skill. And now, maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's fine. What if instead pattern recognition today is a really important skill? Finding information, pulling it together is a very important skill. Those are changes. That doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that change has happened, because change always happens. And if we're going to sit and just resist it and say Google is making us stupid, well, then we're not actually giving ourselves the ability to maximize and take advantage of new opportunities. And then what I meant by what I said, that we also could be proposing incorrect solutions. So maybe you're all familiar. There's been so many news reports about studies about how Facebook makes you depressed. Facebook makes you depressed. But now scientists are starting to go back and look at those studies and are finding that, in fact, those were finding correlation but not causation. In fact, when you dig down into the data, what you're seeing is not that, for example, teenagers are going on Facebook and then becoming depressed, but in fact, that teenagers who are more depressed are going on Facebook. Now, that's a very important distinction, because if your solution, when you hear the first story, is to say, oh, well, then let's take Facebook away from these teenagers, but in fact, Facebook has become part of a solution for depressed teenagers, then you've taken away a valuable tool for them because you thought the problem was wrong. That's what happens when we think that change isn't constant, when we're not willing to sit and understand what change really is, and instead we react very negatively to the thing that we're seeing. So let's talk about some solutions. What have I seen across time in which people have managed to get people to embrace it and to understand change? All right, 3. Number 1, you got to build a bridge from the familiar. So here's a fun thing. We all took a elevator up to this floor, which means that we stepped, I mean, think about it. We stepped into a box with no windows, and it moved us. That was very scary for a long time. It was a terrifying idea. I mean, there's really no other experience that is like that. We otherwise will never step into a completely enclosed space, and it will move us. Cars, airplanes, they all have windows, at least. And we know there's somebody driving it. Maybe it's us. But the elevator was different. But for a very long time, what the elevator had was a person who was moving it. In the early days, literally physically moving it by like pulling a rope, which sounds insane, but that's what they were doing. And then eventually, there was a wheel and so on. And then in the 40s and 50s, the technology existed to have these things move up and down by themselves. And people were freaked out. You know what they said? They said, do you know what the elevator thinks? They were genuinely thinking that. What does the elevator think? I'm stepping into this thing. It's moving by itself. What does it think? It's scary. It's scary. You know what the solution was? The solution, among some other things, but this is a really important one, sounds so simple it's going to sound stupid, but it was important. The solution was adding a female voice that says, going up, going down, floor 1, floor 2. It was replacing the human being that was already in there. It was giving us a bridge from the familiar. And this is something that I think that innovators often totally forget about, because they're so convinced, rightfully so, that they've built something that people will want, that contributes value to the world. And so you forget that when you introduce something that's radically new to people, that those people might be like, ah! And so instead, what you need to do is think, well, what can I do that's already familiar to them? How can I find something to show them that, you know what, different isn't that different? Different isn't that different. Another great example of this was the car. When the car was introduced, we all think of that the major moment for the car was Henry Ford and the Model T. And that's true in that that was able to bring the car to the masses and mass produce the car. But what happened before Henry Ford was perhaps of equal importance. So when the car first came out, it was scary, and if you drove down the street with a car, people would yell, "Get a horse!" at you. They'd yell, "Get a horse!" at you. And so you know what happened? Eventually, people realized, the car makers realized, that you needed to build a bridge from the familiar. People liked their horses. And here were these companies coming along and saying, "I'm going to replace your horse." People don't want that. People don't want that. So what'd you do? Well, you started building horses into the car. Why do we have the word horsepower? Why are so many cars named after horses? In the early days, they were literally, sometimes there were some manufacturers that were building like kind of mechanical-looking horse heads and putting them on the front of the cars. The idea was to say, no, we are not replacing your horse. We're literally giving you a better horse. It's a bridge from the familiar, and it makes a difference. Here's number 2. Don't let the early adopters define you. Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, has this theory that I really like about how to build a company, and it is this: ignore your early customers for your scale customers. The idea is to think about who your scale customer is and how to communicate with them and how to build something for them. And don't get bogged down in what your early customers may want, because they may not be the same thing. And I think this is true for introductions of new technologies. So for example, so here's the Scorcher nuisance. Scorchers were what early bicycle riders were called. They would get on these bicycles and they would just like blaze down. They would smash into people. They were very obnoxious. But this is a thing, right? This is a thing. When new technology comes out, especially very transformative technology, it is often expensive, and therefore it is most accessible to people with wealth. And because there isn't necessarily the infrastructure for this to make sense in their world, they just kind of treat it like toys, and then they come to define what this technology is for the masses. And that can be a real problem. Early car drivers were just like blazing down country roads, hitting farmers' chickens and dogs, and farmers were going out with guns to shoot at the car drivers. Now, that was because the early adopters of the car were being obnoxious, but that didn't mean that the technology was bad. So what you need to do is think about how you can get this thing to the masses and how you can communicate to the masses that this is valuable to all of you, instead of just focusing on those early adopters. I think this is also, for whatever it's worth, the reason why people are so opposed to the kind of e-scooters that you find out on streets right now, because the early adopters were super obnoxious. They were just like leaving them lying around on the sidewalks. You have to get past them. And then here's number 3. Innovate inside the gaps. So the waltz. We think of it as a nice, classy dance now. When it was introduced, scary and scandalous. Scary and scandalous. So here's police breaking up a marathon dance. This was in 1910, but that's at the time where they were just very much concerned about the amount of physical contact that was happening with the waltz. But go back a century earlier to the early 1800s, and there was another concern. Interesting concern. The concern was medical. The concern was that the waltz would literally take years off of your life. This was in medical literature, that the amount of waltzing that you would do would be directly correlating with the years you would lose off your life. Why? Well, they were particularly concerned about women and all the physical activity of the women moving around and spinning, and that's just not something that women should be doing. Their bodies aren't built for it. And yet, here's the thing. They were right and they were wrong. They were right and they were wrong. I was really expecting them to just be totally wrong about this, because most times when you go through history, you see all these crazy medical concerns like bicycle face, and you're like, that's just silly and ridiculous. But in this case, the waltz actually was kind of dangerous for people. It actually was unhealthy. The reason, however, wasn't because of the waltz. It wasn't because of women's bodies. It was because they were waltzing in buildings that did not have modern ventilation, that were using gas lighting. They were dancing on these things called crash pads or crash something or other, which are basically these rugs that had collected all sorts of dust, and now they're dancing on it. It's just getting kicked up into the air, and they're breathing it all in, and they're wearing extremely tight clothing. So yeah, the waltz was unhealthy, but it wasn't the problem with the waltz. It was the problem with literally everything around the waltz. So you have to identify, where's the gap? Where's the gap here between the user and the innovation? And I would say that the scooters are another great example of this. So people are going out on these scooters right now, and they are, in some cases, they're getting hit by cars. There are accidents. Some people are dying. It sounds scary, and those are tragedies. But scooter companies are now looking inside the data about who is having accidents. What they're finding is that the most accidents, the majority of accidents, take place on someone's very first ride. The problem isn't technology. The problem is that people don't know how to use it, and that they're not comfortable with it on the first ride. And if anybody's hopped on one of these scooters, you know that the first ride is pretty wobbly. Pretty wobbly. And so now they're starting to run, I know Lime in particular is doing this, they're starting to run these sessions where they'll bring people and introduce them to the technology and get them comfortable with it. That's innovating inside the gap. The problem isn't the technology. The problem was something between the technology and the use. That is what will get people away from the scary part of it and towards embracing and understanding how it fits into their world. So those are some things. Obviously, history is complicated, and there's a lot to see and digest. But I hope that this at least gets you thinking that because people react to something negatively does not mean perhaps that they are foolish. It means that they are reacting naturally the way that we all just think. And what we often need is storytelling and good understanding about the people who are receiving these innovations, receiving these new technologies, and the things that they may be missing in their understanding of how it fits into their world. And then it is our job as innovators, as people who are involved in creating the world in which innovation takes place, to pave that path and get them towards this very unnatural, but at the same time, important thing, which is change. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. Anytime my team, I tend to be a morning person, so anytime my team thinks I'm